Disclaimer: this content is intended for a mature audience. Viewer discretion is advised. I never thought a simple dinner invitation would lead to something that would shake the very foundation of my marriage. But that night, as I stood in my own living room, my husband's guest looked me in the eye and made a request so unexpected, so shocking, that I felt the air leave my lungs. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just heard. Was this some kind of joke? A misunderstanding? Or was there a deeper truth I hadn't yet uncovered? It all started when my husband, Daniel, invited his old friend over for dinner. I had heard about Jake before, stories of their college days, their late-night adventures, and the way they had always been there for each other. But I had never actually met him in person until that night. From the moment he walked in, there was something about him that felt different. He was charming, confident, and carried himself with an ease that made it impossible not to pay attention to him. But beneath his warm smile, I sensed something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The evening went smoothly at first. Laughter filled the room, glasses clinked, and stories from the past flowed effortlessly. But then, just as I was clearing the dishes, Jake suddenly turned to me with a look so serious that it sent a chill down my spine. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke, and the words that left his mouth changed everything. I glanced at Daniel, expecting him to laugh it off or dismiss it as a joke, but he didn't. Instead, he remained silent, his expression unreadable. That's when I realized this wasn't a casual remark. This was real. My heart pounded as 100 thoughts flooded my mind. How was I supposed to respond to something like this? What would happen if I said no? And more terrifyingly, what would happen if I said yes? Now, I need to hear from you. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you agree to something that could change your marriage forever? Or would you risk the consequences of saying no? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to hear the rest of this story in part 2. Trust me, things are only just getting started. Daniel's silence felt heavier than words. My eyes darted between him and Jake, searching for some kind of explanation, some sign that this was a misunderstanding. But Daniel wouldn't look at me. His fingers tapped lightly against his glass, his jaw clenched just enough for me to notice. Jake, on the other hand, was completely at ease. He leaned back in his chair, watching me with quiet confidence, as if he already knew what my answer would be. There was something unnerving about the way he carried himself, like a man who had nothing to lose. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" I asked, forcing a small, nervous laugh, hoping I had misheard him. Jake smirked slightly, tilting his head. "You heard me." The way he said it, so casual, so sure of himself, made the room feel smaller. The warmth from the evening had completely disappeared, replaced by an unshakable tension that settled in my stomach like a rock. I glanced at Daniel again, waiting for him to speak, to say something, anything, to break the silence. But he just ran a hand through his hair and let out a slow breath. "Maybe we should talk about this later," he muttered under his breath. Later? What did that even mean? My husband, the man I had built a life with, was acting like this was normal, like it wasn't completely insane. Jake didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, he looked amused, as if he was enjoying watching me struggle to process his words. "No rush," he said, lifting his glass to his lips. "Take your time." But that was the problem. I didn't need time. I needed answers. My mind raced back over the evening. Had I missed something? A clue? A hint? Had Daniel known about this request before Jake even arrived? The way he was acting, so calm, so prepared, made me feel like I was the only one caught off guard. I folded my arms, trying to steady my voice. Daniel, what's going on? Did you know he was going to say this? He hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough. Jake let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Come on, Daniel, you should have told her. Told me what? And just like that, I realized this wasn't just about Jake's request. There was something deeper at play, something my husband hadn't told me. Now I need to hear from you. What would you do in my situation? Would you press for the truth, or would you wait for Daniel to explain? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Because trust me, the real story is just beginning. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My own husband, sitting just a few feet away, wouldn't meet my eyes. That hesitation, that tiny pause before he answered, it told me everything. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He knew. My chest tightened. Daniel, I said again, my voice quieter this time. What's going on? He exhaled slowly, still not looking at me. It's complicated, he muttered. Complicated. That word sent a chill through me. It was the kind of word people used when they were hiding something, when they didn't want to say the truth out loud. Jake just sat there, watching, clearly entertained by the tension in the room. Look, he said, setting his glass down on the table with a soft clink. I don't want to cause trouble between you two, but I also don't believe in keeping secrets. Secrets. My fingers gripped the edge of the table. Was that what this was? A secret my own husband had been keeping from me? Then say it, I shot back, my pulse racing. If you're so honest, then just tell me. Jake glanced at Daniel, almost as if he was giving him one last chance to speak first. When Daniel still said nothing, Jake shrugged. All right, he said. You deserve to know. I braced myself. You see, Daniel and I go way back, he started, his voice smooth and steady. College, business, personal matters, we've shared a lot over the years. I already knew that much. What I didn't know was why my husband suddenly looked so tense, like he was silently willing Jake to stop talking. Jake leaned forward slightly. But there's one thing Daniel never told you. My stomach twisted. I was there, Jake said, his gaze locked on mine. The night before your wedding. For a moment, I couldn't process what he was saying. The night before my wedding? My mind flashed back to that time, how nervous I had been, how much I had worried about everything going perfectly. I had been so focused on the future, on becoming Daniel's wife, that I hadn't questioned anything else. I swallowed hard. What are you trying to say? Jake smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. I think Daniel should be the one to explain. I turned to my husband, my heart pounding. Daniel? He finally looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw it. The truth he had been hiding all this time. What do you think Daniel has been keeping from me? Drop your predictions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story is far from over. Daniel's eyes met mine, and for the first time that night, I saw something raw in them. Regret, guilt, fear. It was all there, written across his face, like a confession he wasn't ready to say out loud. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own voice. Daniel, I said, my throat dry. What happened the night before our wedding? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, running a hand through his hair. Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the scene unfold like he had all the time in the world. He had already done his part. Now it was Daniel's turn. Seconds passed, stretching unbearably between us. Then finally, my husband spoke. There's something I never told you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt my stomach twist, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen. That night, I wasn't alone. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was stare at him, waiting for him to finish. I was with Jake, Daniel continued, finally looking up at me. And someone else. I swallowed hard. Who? Jake let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Now, that's the real question, isn't it? I turned back to Daniel, my pulse racing. Who, Daniel? He hesitated again, but this time I saw something shift in him. He wasn't just afraid, he was protecting something. Or someone. It doesn't matter, he finally said. My stomach dropped. It matters to me. Jake smirked. See, this is why I came tonight. You deserve to know the truth. The whole truth. I clenched my fists. Then say it. Jake glanced at Daniel again, giving him a chance to speak. But when my husband stayed silent, he let out a slow sigh. All right, Jake said. The woman Daniel was with that night, she's not just some stranger. My breath hitched. She's someone you know. The words sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced through every possible person in my life. Who could it be? A friend? A colleague? Someone from my past? And then, for the first time since the conversation started, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Who do you think the mystery woman is? Drop your guesses in the comments and don't forget to subscribe, because the biggest twist is still coming. A cold wave of dread rushed over me. Someone I knew. My mind spiraled, running through names, faces, people who had been at my wedding, people in my life who could have been with Daniel that night. It felt impossible. It felt like a lie. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. You're messing with me, I said, my voice shaking. You're just trying to cause problems. Jake's smirk didn't fade. If anything, he looked amused, like he had been expecting my reaction. Believe what you want, he said. But deep down, you already know, don't you? I turned to Daniel, praying, begging, for him to deny it, to tell me this was all a sick joke, that Jake was lying. But my husband just sat there, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than words. And then it hit me, a memory, a moment I had buried because it had never made sense until now. The night before our wedding, my sister had disappeared for hours. She had told me she was stressed, that she needed some time alone before the big day. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? She was my sister, my best friend. I stared at Daniel, my stomach twisting. No, I whispered. His jaw tensed, his fingers tightened around the glass in front of him. I could barely get the words out. It was her, wasn't it? Daniel didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. My breath caught in my throat. My sister, the one person I had trusted more than anyone else. The person who had stood beside me at the altar, smiling as if nothing had happened. Jake let out a low whistle. There it is, he said, watching my reaction. The moment the truth finally sinks in. I felt sick. My hands were trembling, my vision blurred. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was sit there, drowning in the betrayal. Why? I choked out. Why would you do this to me? Daniel finally spoke, his voice rough. It wasn't supposed to happen. That doesn't change the fact that it did. My voice cracked, my anger bubbling over. You let me marry you without telling me, and she looked me in the eye and acted like nothing happened? Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with his hands. I didn't want to lose you. I let out a bitter laugh, the weight of his words hitting me like a punch to the chest. And what? You thought I'd never find out? That I'd live my whole life never knowing the truth? Jake leaned forward, his expression turning serious. That's not even the worst part. I turned to him, my heart still hammering. What do you mean? He exchanged a look with Daniel, and for the first time that night, I saw something close to panic in my husband's eyes. Jake sighed. Your sister? She didn't just leave that night. The room felt like it was spinning. What are you talking about? Jake hesitated, then said, She came back. And when she did, she wasn't alone. My blood ran cold. Who did she come back with? What else has been hidden from me? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story is far from over. Daniel's face went pale. Jake's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My sister didn't just leave that night, she came back, and she wasn't alone. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was she with? I demanded, my voice shaking. Daniel didn't answer. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Jake, however, had no problem filling in the silence. She came back with someone who had a reason to keep things quiet, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. Someone who made sure Daniel stayed silent, too. I turned to my husband, barely able to breathe. Daniel? His chest rose and fell in deep, uneven breaths. She wasn't supposed to come back, he finally said. And when she did, she wasn't alone because she... He stopped, his voice breaking. Jake leaned forward, his voice low. Because she was pregnant. The words hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I felt dizzy, my world tilting beneath me. Pregnant. My sister had been pregnant. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. No, that doesn't make sense. Daniel buried his face in his hands. She told me she was going to leave town, that no one would ever know. But then, she came back. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with regret. And she told me the baby was mine. The room spun. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. My own sister, carrying my husband's child. Jake let out a low whistle. Now you see why Daniel never told you. Tears burned at the back of my eyes. Where is she now? I whispered. Daniel hesitated. She left again. She said she'd raise the baby on her own, that she didn't want to ruin our lives. My hands trembled. My sister had been carrying this secret, just like Daniel. And yet, she had looked me in the eyes for years, pretending everything was fine. But then something else clicked. A final, horrifying realization. If she wanted to stay away, then why did Jake bring this up now? Jake smirked. Because she's back, and she's not alone this time either. Who do you think she brought with her? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because the final chapter of this story is going to change everything.
I barely had time to process Jake's words before a sharp knock echoed through the house. My breath hitched. I looked at Daniel, but he was already on his feet, his face drained of all color. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the secrets, pressed down on me all at once. My sister was back, and she wasn't alone. Daniel hesitated for a moment before moving toward the door. My entire body was frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. When the door finally swung open, I felt the room shrink around me. There she was, my sister. She looked different, older, stronger, like someone who had carried too much for too long. And standing beside her, clutching her hand, was a little girl with familiar brown eyes. Daniel's eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of what was unspoken filled the silence. My sister met my gaze, her expression unreadable. I didn't come here to ruin anything, she finally said, but my daughter deserves to know the truth. The word daughter sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over me. I didn't know whether to scream, to cry, to run. My entire life had been built on a foundation of trust, of love. only to realize that everything I thought I knew had been a lie. Daniel swallowed hard. Why now? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. My sister sighed, squeezing the little girl's hand. Because she started asking questions, and I couldn't lie to her the way you lied to her. She nodded toward me, and something inside me shattered. I looked at the child again, at the way she held on to my sister with such innocence, completely unaware of the storm she had just walked into. And suddenly, I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I took a deep breath. Then tell her, I said. Tell her everything. Daniel's head snapped toward me, panic flashing across his face. But I was done living in the dark. The truth had already destroyed us. There was no reason to keep it hidden anymore. My sister nodded, then knelt beside her daughter, her voice soft. Sweetheart, this is your father. The little girl looked up at Daniel with wide, curious eyes. And just like that, the story I thought I knew came to an end. But for them, for all of us, it was only the beginning of something else. How do you feel about this ending? Would you have forgiven Daniel, or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat.